With a good understanding of how events work inside of a browser at a high level and from a conceptual level, understanding the event loop, the callback queue, the stack, as well as the web API, and how all of those items within the browser function to handle asynchronous or long-running events. Now it's time to jump into how do we handle those events and how do we create event listeners or event handlers in JavaScript code. And we're going to do that using a simple HTML page. I went ahead and downloaded a Bootstrap template that provides us with a pretty decent looking HTML page right here with a lot of buttons on it. So this is the SB admin. It's a free Bootstrap template where all the HTML is done for you, and it uses Bootstrap to give it a good look and feel. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using these buttons that are predefined right here that kind of show us the different styles of buttons that this template provides us. We're not worried about the CSS or the styling. I just wanted something that looks good. And we're just going to be focusing on capturing events that are created by these buttons as the user interacts with them on our page. What we're going to do is we're going to start out with the split button primary, and we're going to do something to make it interactive. Let's go ahead and open up the inspector really quick. Let's look at the console right here. And as we talked about when we talked about event handlers from a conceptual level, when we click on our buttons right here, we'll see that nothing really happens except for we get brought back to the top of the page. And that is primarily because if we look at the code, so go ahead and right click and choose inspect, we'll see that it's really an anchor tag and the href is set to pound. And when it's set to pound, what it really does is it takes us to the top of the page, and that's not really what we want. We really just want to capture the button's events as they happen without the page resetting. So let's go ahead and let's find this button in our HTML. We know that within this anchor tag, which makes up the button's look and feel, we've got a span, and this span right here uses Font Awesome to create a little icon for this flag portion of the button. And then we've got the span right here that provides the text, and we know that this text is split button primary. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back to Visual Studio in our HTML, and I'm going to go ahead and find that button in our HTML. Now that we've got the button, really we want to put the event on our anchor tag. So what we're going to do is we are going to add an ID to this anchor tag, and we're kind of going to use the exact same text that we have in the bottom just to uniquely identify it. But we're going to put that into a more ID-friendly format, which means we're going to do the split dash button dash primary with everything lowercase and easy to use as an ID. And then we're going to copy this ID with a Control-C. And so now we know where this is, and we've got an ID in order to get to that particular element so we can add events to it. So let's go ahead and let's set everything up so that we can add events. Now, because we want to make sure we're following good separation of concerns and we're using proper JavaScript, we are not going to add the event handler right on the element, which would be using something like the onClick event handler right here and then writing JavaScript right here. We don't want to do that because that blends our JavaScript and our HTML, which blurs the lines in our separation of concern that we like to keep separate. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this ID to get a reference to it in JavaScript, and we're going to use an external JavaScript file to add all of our event handlers to our HTML. So let's go ahead and create a new JavaScript file. Now, although I have a folder for JavaScript right here, which holds the JavaScript that's specific to this template, I'm just going to go ahead and put it in the root just so we know that this is my JavaScript. I'm going to say my events, or my event listeners. Let's go ahead and do that. My event listeners.js. So this is going to be the JavaScript file in which we get references to our HTML elements and where we add event listeners to those HTML elements. As always, we got to make sure we pull this JavaScript file into our HTML so that it's referencing all of the HTML in this file. Now you might be tempted to add your JavaScript up here in the head tag because it is okay to add script tags here. The problem is that when they're in the head, what's going to happen is as this HTML page is parsed by the browser, it's going to run into our script tag right here. And it's going to cause that script tag to be pulled from the web server and then executed immediately. And depending upon how fast the network is and how fast that JavaScript file is pulled, what's going to happen is that JavaScript may actually beat the entire page from being rendered, and it may execute before we actually have the body of the HTML executed. When that happens, you're going to get null references on all of your HTML elements because they don't exist yet, because the DOM hasn't been built and it hasn't been rendered in the browser yet. The way we fix that is if we add a script tag up here, we actually have to check in here for the document.onload event, or make sure that the document has loaded before we begin to execute our JavaScript. The other way to make sure that the document or the DOM has been loaded before your JavaScript executes is to not put it in the head tag. Instead, you want to put it at the bottom of your body. And if you notice, all of the Bootstrap template stuff, as well as the JavaScript specific to this template that I downloaded, are all at the bottom of the body tag. And of course, what this does is it allows the browser parser to parse all of this HTML and build the DOM before it begins requesting these JavaScript resources. That means that our DOM is done being parsed and created as these JavaScript files are being loaded by the web browser as they come in as separate requests to the web server for those resource files. And because our DOM has already been created, when this executes, the DOM elements will exist and we won't run into null references. So let's go ahead and add our custom scripts for events. So let's go ahead and add our script tag, and our source is going to pull the my event listeners JavaScript from our web server. And it'll pull it at the very end after everything else is already loaded. So make sure you put it at the bottom of your body, but before the body closing tag. And then it'll be sure to be loaded after all of your HTML is loaded. So now we've got an ID referencing this particular button that we want to mess with. So let's go ahead and inspect it and make sure we've got our ID right there. ID is split button primary. And we know that we are going to want to mess with this span that has a class text in order to update this text so we can see that this button is actually being messed with based on events that happen. We could also have it do other things, but really we're just going to be modifying the text within these buttons to show when those events happen and how we're manipulating our HTML elements based on those events occurring. So let's jump over to my event listener now that we've got it inside of our HTML and now that we've got an ID so we can reference that. We're going to go ahead and reference that anchor tag so that we've got a reference to that button or what HTML elements compose that button. We're going to use a constant. Now I'm not sure if you've run into constant yet. We've used a lot of, or you've seen a lot of var, and we've used a lot of let to create our variables. And var and let both allow the variable that you create to be reassigned with a new value after it's been initialized. Const creates a constant variable, meaning that once the variable is initialized, the value of that variable cannot be reassigned. And we use const a lot with references to HTML elements when in our JavaScript because we don't really want those reassigned. We always want to be able to get to the same HTML element, and we don't want our script to accidentally reassign it to a different HTML element and then update that element thinking that we're updating a different one. So we use const just so that we know that that is the element that we pulled originally. So we're going to do const, and we are pulling the split button primary. So let's go ahead and turn this into a valid JavaScript variable name. I'll do split button primary as our JavaScript constant variable reference to it. And then we're going to use our document dot, and we're going to do query selector. And then in our query selector, we're going to go ahead and look for that ID that we have. And the ID that we created was this one, the split dash button dash primary. So that'll get us a reference to that anchor tag that is acting as a button. And we can verify that we're actually getting to it and that we don't have a null by doing a console.log, letting it load in our browser, going to our console, and we can see right here we have an A tag with the ID split button primary, and then we can see everything that has to do with that particular HTML element. So we know we're getting a reference to it, so let's get rid of that. Now the way that we add event listeners to an event on an HTML element is, as we've seen, first we get a reference to that HTML element, then we can do split button primary, so the reference to our HTML element, and then we can do add event listener. And when we do an add event listener, we have to identify the type of event we want to listen to. And really, this comes back to our event reference in the Mozilla Developer Network. And right here, we're working with mouse events, and we are going to focus on click, maybe mouse enter and mouse leave, or mouse move or mouse over. We'll decide which ones we want to play with as we go. But we're going to start out with mouse click. So that's going to be the one that we want to reference first. So let's go ahead and add an event listener to that event. Now, when we identify the event we want to listen to, we're just going to use a string with the name of that event. So we're going for the click event. Now, an event listener is really just a function that gets called when the event occurs. So really, the reason why you hear people call them event handlers and not necessarily event listeners is the reality is that we're adding an event listener behind the scenes, and the listener is handled by the web API, which is handled by the browser. And so the browser actually creates a listener that listens for this event to happen. And then what we're really providing right here is the handler, or the function that we want executed when the event happens. So let's make sure we understand the difference here. The listener is actually created, handled, and managed by the browser. And it's what's created when this function gets called on our element. So the browser creates a listener, and we define what event we want the listener added to, and then we provide the code that we want executed when the event happens. So really what we're providing right here is the handler, or the event handler. And the browser is creating a listener that will call our handler when the event happens. So make sure you understand the difference between a listener and a handler and why you hear people using them interchangeably. So it's really just a function that we want called. And when that function gets called, we get past a reference to the actual event that happened, which provides us with a whole bunch of information that we can access on that event, including a reference to the element that caused the event to happen. And we can mess with those later on. So we got a function, it takes in an event. So this is an anonymous function, and we are providing this function definition as a handler to the event listener that gets created, and it listens for the click event. And this is our handler function. And we make it anonymous because we're not ever going to reference it. The listener will reference it and execute it when the event happens. So we're just creating a definition, or a function definition that provides the code we want executed. And really what we're going to want to do in our HTML, if we go back to this element, is we're going to want to get a reference to this span that is of class text, and we're going to want to change this text so that we can see every time this button gets clicked. Also, we're going to want to get rid of this $sign so that every time we click on this, it doesn't go back to the top of the page. So let's jump to our HTML really quick. Let's go ahead and find our split button text right here. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the $href. the pound in our href, and let's see if that'll stop. Awesome. Our page is no longer reloading, and that'll make it easier. Of course, you can see our text is no longer white, and that's because we don't have a link, and the browser recognizes that, so the styling kind of changes, but we're not worried about that right now. We just don't want to have to scroll back down every time we click the button. So that helps us with that. And then we know we want to get to this particular span, and we want to change the text or the inner HTML on this element every time the button gets clicked. That means we're going to need a reference to this element which lives inside of our A tag. So let's go ahead and write the code for that inside of our event handler. And of course we want to do that inside of our event handler because this is the code that will execute when the event happens and not before. So let's go ahead and get a reference to that. We're going to use const again, and we are going to get the button text. So let's just do button text. And we know that it's going to be document.querySelector. And of course, there's different ways you can do this. We could use the event. We could get the reference to the element that caused the event, and then we could pull its children. But we're just going to keep it simple right now. We'll just say document.querySelector. And then we are going to go for the span tag that is a child of our split button primary. So let's do the span with the text class. So we're looking for the split button primary, so the element with the ID of split button primary. Then within that element, we're looking for a child element that is a span and has the class text on it. And that's going to give us a reference to the button text, which is right here. And then what we want to do is we want to do something with that button's text. So we're going to want to go ahead and get a hold of the text from that button. So let's just do let text equal button text dot inner HTML. So now we've got that saved. And then let's go ahead and change the text. Let's do button text dot inner HTML equals, and then let's manipulate that text. And let's do text plus, and then we're going to go ahead and add something to it. Let's go ahead and let's add to it the number of times it gets clicked, maybe. Maybe we should do that. And let's go ahead and create ourselves a split button primary click count. So let's just go ahead and copy that just so we know what it's referencing. Let's do let split button click count. We'll start it out at 0. And then we're just going to go ahead and we are going to be taking that text and we are just going to be adding each time a click happens to it. So let's go ahead and we'll need to increment that counter. So let's do our split button click count plus plus, just so we know. And then to that text, let's just go ahead and let's add the click count to it. So let's do split button primary click count. Now, we can probably guess that each time we're just going to be adding numbers to the text, which means it'll probably go, split button primary space 1, and then space 1, 2, then space 1, 3. If you get what I'm saying. And that's because we're not keeping a reference to the text, but we're pulling the text and then just adding something to it. You'll see what I mean when we go ahead and start clicking on the button. So here our code has reloaded. Let's click on it. You can see we added a 1 there. Now we've got a 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we could probably fix that just by getting a reference to the text as well. So let's do let, and we'll do our split button primary text. And right now it'll be empty until we set it. And let's just set it to this really quick. So let's fix this by taking this. We'll get a reference to it. And then we'll just do the inner text off of that reference. So dot inner HTML. That means we really don't need this anymore because we already have it. We don't need this one either because we have a reference to it. And now, really, we just have to grab this particular variable, put it right there. Now we have the original text that was in this before we started messing with it. And now we just do that text plus the click count every time. So let's see if we've fixed it. So everything's reloaded, and we don't have anything running, but we do have an error. Button text is not defined, and that would be this right here. So we still need a reference to our button itself. So let's go ahead and add ourselves a reference to the button. So let's do let. Oh, we already have a reference to our button, but we need a reference to our button text. So let, and let's do our split button primary text we pulled out. And so we want our split button primary text span. And you can see how we're going about this process. It's not too difficult to understand, and you know, there's probably better ways to do this, but we're just kind of doing this on the fly and just messing with it and trying to figure it out and playing around with how we might manipulate stuff. So now that we've got our span, let's go ahead and set the inner text of the span. So let's run through what we did really quick so we definitely understand. We got a reference to the span element so that we can set the inner HTML on it. And we needed to do that outside of our function because every time we click, we don't want to get a new reference to it. So we do that outside. And of course, we want to make this a const because we're referencing an actual element in our HTML. Then we want to get the original, or we want our starting click count to be 0 because it hasn't clicked yet. If we did this inside of our handler, this would be reset to 0 every time we fired our event. And we don't want that to happen. We just want it to increment by 1 each time our handler is executed, each time the click happens. So you can see we need these references outside of the handler. And then of course we want the original text that lives inside of that span so that we can take that original text and then simply update it by adding the count to it. Let's go ahead and add some more text with a space so that we can see how many clicks is happening. Now that we've got references to those things, we can use them inside of our event handler, and that is because each of these are referenced inside of the parent scope in which this event listener is defined. And if you remember that from earlier videos where we talked about parent and child scope, we know that we can access variables inside the parent scope inside of a child. And so here we're incrementing the primary click count by 1 each time it gets clicked. So this will go from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 each time it's clicked. And then we're taking our primary button, we're setting, or that text, that span that's inside of our button or our anchor tag, we're setting the inner HTML to the original text that we had plus the click count. So instead of seeing what we used to see where the split button had a split button primary, then 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, now we should just see it go to a :1, :2, 3, and now we can see that we're increasing the click every time. So here we used the click event on an anchor tag right here, and we're manipulating an HTML tag that lives inside of this A tag after having grabbed references to everything that we need in order to update that text properly. Hopefully you can see the process I went through to do that. So let's do this. This right here is our click event listener with handler. All right, and now we're going to go ahead and we are going to do let's see which event we want to play with now. Let's go ahead and let's do a mouse enter and a mouse leave. So mouse enter, mouse leave. And if we click on mouse enter, we'll go ahead and see the definition on it, what happens. So make sure you go and read through the documentation and how it all works. So let's play with the mouse enter and mouse leave really quick, and then we'll be done with event handlers and how all that works. This time though, on our mouse enter and mouse leave, we're actually going to do something like modify the HTML in our document by adding new elements to our page and then removing that element. And we'll do that really quick here. So let's do mouse enter event. And then we'll do our mouse leave. And of course, these both have handlers. So let's go ahead and add our text that we have with handler and with handler. All right, it's pretty much the same thing, except for we are going to use a different button this time. And let's go ahead, well, just to keep things quick and easy, let's still use the same button since we already have a reference to it. And let's just add event handlers for those two events to this same button. So let's go ahead and just copy this code really quick, and we're going to have to modify it for each of them. And let's do let's put it down here. Let's go ahead and do a mouse enter. So this is going to be the mouse enter event. And then let's go ahead and do a mouse leave event. And we're still going to want to do those things, but instead of changing text, we're going to go ahead and add and remove an HTML element that we are going to add to the document. Or maybe let's just go ahead and hide something instead of adding a new one, just so we can make this quicker. And let's hide this particular button. So let's inspect. We know that this is the split button success. So let's go ahead and find it in our HTML, split button success. It's the one right below. Let's go ahead and give it an ID. And let's make it ID worthy. So split dash button dash success. Let's make sure we copy that. And we know that's the one we're going to show and hide as we mouse enter and mouse leave our split button primary. Well, to mouse enter and mouse leave, that means we're going to need a reference to that split button, this particular one, the split button success. So with this ID, we're going to go ahead and get a reference to that. But since we're going to be using it in both of these event handlers, we're going to want to get a const reference to it. So let's do const, and let's do split button success, but let's make this JavaScript correct. So split button success equals, and then let's do a document.query selector, and then we will do it for the ID. And now we should have a reference to the split button success. And then really on this split button success, we are going to be showing and hiding that particular element. And so we are going to show or hide that element using JavaScript. And let's do that. So we've got a reference to it. And on the click, we're just going to go ahead and set its style. And we know that we can show and hide using the display property of our CSS. And we can do that directly on an HTML element. So let's do our split button success. So that's our new reference. And then we'll do dot style. Oops. Dot style. Dot. And then let's do display. And we're going to set that property to none. Oops, not mom, but none. All right. And then, of course, when we are in the mouse leave, we want that to go back. So then we will do a display block. Now, we've kind of done this without testing it, so let's go back and give it a shot and see what happens. Right, we get some errors down here, so let's look at our console. Cannot read property style of null. Right, so let's go ahead and look at this. We've got const split button success equals document dot query selector, and then split button success. Let's make sure we got split button success. Oh, we haven't saved our HTML. You can tell by that little circle right there. So we never saved that this had an ID. So let's go ahead and make sure we always save our documents since Visual Studio Code does not auto-save for us. Let's go back and now let's try. Oh, we can see. Now, When I do display block, it kind of messes up the bootstrap styling, so that's probably not the best styling change we could make. There's probably a class in Bootstrap that we could add and remove in order to do that, but this gives us an idea of what happens when we modify an HTML element based on event and how we can manipulate a document element, a different document element, based on event happening in a different element. And that is, we can still do the 1, 2, 3, 4 because we're still handling that click event, but when we enter that element with the mouse, we can see that we're hiding that split button success or the green button below it. And when we exit it, that button comes back. Kind of messed up the styling just because Bootstrap doesn't like us changing that back to a block, but you can see how that works. So we're actually handling multiple events. We're handling 3 events on this one button. We've got the click event, and we've got the mouse enter and mouse leave events, all manipulating the HTML in our DOM. So this is a really good example of how we can use event listeners created by this add event listener function on our HTML elements. We can specify the event we want to handle, and then we can provide an event handler. And in that handler, we can execute the code that manipulates our HTML DOM or does something. If we wanted to, we could actually do an XML HTTP request and call an API and pull back some JSON data if we wanted to inside of this handler. And we'll get to something like that in the future as we get more competent with our event handlers, and then we begin calling web APIs in the future.